Renaud Dahousse, you gave the keynote speech at the Biennial Conference of the European Community Studies Association yesterday in Montreal. The title was Europe After the Crisis. A lot of people think that Europe is passé, it's gone, that it's been very much weakened by the economic crisis since 2008. You don't share that assessment, right?
I don't indeed. I think that, well, though I recognize it's a widespread opinion even within Europe, and it's fair to say that there's a growing contestation of the EU nowadays in a large number of countries. At the same time, though, there are two things to be said. One, as a matter of fact, despite all the gloomy forecasts of the past 2-3 years, as a matter of fact, the EU is still around. The euro has not collapsed. It's actually stronger than ever, which is becoming sort of a problem for EU exports. And secondly, without really many people noticing it, there have been huge transfers of authority to Brussels, which suggests that the functional response to the crisis was, let's say, seen as a need for a consolidation of the EU's authority.
But that's surprising because everybody's saying that the Commission is very weak, that the European Parliament is also not particularly influential with the upcoming elections, and we'll see a lot of people who actually, voting for anti-Europe parties. So how can you say that European institutions are actually stronger than ever?
Well, the first thing, you're right to say that the common wisdom is that the EU has been weakened, its supranational institutions are weaker. But, Canadians should be aware that federal systems are complex political systems, and therefore we face much the same problem in Europe. That is to say, very few people actually can mastermind the complexity of the situation. Very few people have actually read the major texts that have been signed in the past few years. And if you look at the details, you'll find out that indeed very substantial chunks of powers have been conferred on supranational authorities. Let me emphasize, it's not that all of a sudden national leaders have converted to a kind of federalist ethos, but simply it was a functional response to a functional problem. And at the end of the day, it leaves us with an EU system in which central institutions are, let's say, enjoying greater authority than in the past.
So the paradox is that heads of government and state in Europe are actually willingly giving more power to Brussels. That's more or less what you're saying. And you show also that, and that may come as a surprise to a lot of Canadians, that since the crisis with the 2-pack and the 6-pack and the fiscal compact, now the European Commission has actually a lot of authority on national budgets, right? How does that work?
Well, the first thing to be said about that, it's because it really is illustrative of the trend I'm trying to describe, is that with these changes, the EU Commission has been granted an authority that had been denied to it at the time the euro was set up. At that time, it was proposed to grant it more authority over national budgets, and it was flatly turned down by all governments, simply because they said we want to retain control of our own budget, because, as we know, the budget is at the center of public policy, right? It really affects each and every policy area. But it could no longer be the case. This decentralized system could not remain untouched in a situation where a number of countries had to provide financial assistance to their neighbors. They wanted to be sure that the money that was made available would be spent as wisely as possible, let's say. Hence the need for greater controls. And now, as a matter of fact, the first thing to do, a government has to do when it prepares its draft budget is no longer to send it to the relevant parliamentary committee in the national capital, but to send it to Brussels and to have it cleared by the European Commission, which is, of course, a very substantial transfer of authority.
So it's a bit as if here in Canada, provinces had to get their budgets approved by Ottawa before they're
Absolutely.
even adopted by the legislative assemblies. So that's a lot of power to the European Commission. There will be elections in May to elect new members of the European Parliament. As I mentioned, there seems to be a wave of euroscepticism among the public. So, I mean, how do you reconcile the fact that on the one hand you have European institutions that are increasingly powerful, and the fact that for a large number of Europeans they should not have all that power? I mean, how can they be more responsive to their electorate?
Well, again, this is, we are in a paradoxical situation because the huge transfers of authority that I have described actually have taken place without any strong demand from basically anybody among the national leaders or even within public opinion at large. There is no real support for greater integration. On the contrary. Secondly, the policy line that has been imposed by, well, largely by Germany and her allies to the EU is a policy of fiscal austerity. That's not a good way to make friends, as we know out of experience. Hence, the enhanced opposition the EU is faced with in a large number of countries, not least, of course, those countries that are more deeply affected by fiscal austerity. So there is, let's say, there are wide expectations that the forthcoming European elections will result in a strengthening of, let's say, anti-federalist movements, eurosceptic movements, opposition to Europe in various ways. But so what? This is commonplace in all federal systems, right? We're used to the fact that basically if you want to become president in the US, you have to wage an entire Washington campaign in the first place in the primaries in order to get elected. So the EU in that respect is not different from any federal system that we know. As long, of course, as this opposition is does not reach dramatic proportions, which we don't know yet. So it's a part of the story that still is to be written.
And one thing that's very new in these elections is that each party in the European Parliament is putting forward their own candidate to become, they hope, president of the European Commission. So we have Martin Schulz for the Socialists, we have a Jean-Claude Juncker for the Conservatives, and we have Guy Verhofstadt, for example, for the Liberals. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, I think as we saw, we are in a phase in which there is a growing divide between, on the one hand, what gets decided at the top, that is to say major transfers of authority to the center, and on the other, the people's feelings at large. So we need to find ways to reconcile these two trends and to make it possible for the EU to function in a smooth manner. So it's important indeed that people get a say, one way or another, over what gets decided in Brussels. And I think this attempt at identifying candidates for the top position, is to say that the presidency of the European Commission, and B, elements of a political program for pan-European party federations, makes sense. They provide people at least a greater sense of what's going on in Brussels, and possibly limited ability to influence the eventual course of events. But of course, it won't per se. It won't be sufficient because people will soon find out that whoever gets in the seat of the current president of the Commission, he or she will have to sort of find compromises with a variety of parties in the parliament, with national governments, and so on and so forth. So it's bound to remain, I think, a consensus system for well, for the foreseeable future, let's say.
One last question, Renaud Dahousse. You teach at Sciences Po in Paris, but you're Belgian, and you were in a former life a student of comparative federalism. What do you think Canadians can learn from the way the EU functions, and vice versa? Can the Europeans learn anything from Canadian federalism?
Oh yeah. To answer the second question first, it's clear that first of all, one difficulty about the EU is that it's an attempt at political innovation. That is to say, people try to invent a new political system to let's say, find ways for states to cooperate and yet provide for a greater say to the peoples in their respective countries. So it's an attempt at a political innovation, but it's not without precedent. I mean, we have, you in Canada have a substantial experience in let's say, the problems of compound political systems, and indeed, I think there's much to be learned from a comparison between those systems. Just to illustrate this point, a very problematic feature of the EU system is the fact that it rests a lot on national governments, let's say, pooling sovereignty, yes, but also co-managing European policies in various ways. Which is, of course, reminiscent of the Canadian system of executive federalism, which is, I'm not saying that this is a model that we should emulate on the other side of the Atlantic, but clearly the problems you face here are very similar to many of the problems we face in Europe, and there is, I think, a great interest in trying to make sense of both the ways in which problems are perceived on both sides of the Atlantic, and also possibly to discuss possible remedies to the weaknesses of our respective systems. So there's much to be done in that respect.
Well, Renaud Dahousse, thank you for sharing these thoughts with us, and have a nice day.
My pleasure. Thank you.